Can I get you a water before we land?
That would mean more than you know.
Sir, I need you to put your tray table up. We're beginning our descent. Sorry, long flight. I lost track of time. It happens to everyone. Can I get you a water before we land? That would mean more than you know. Nobody in seat 34C looked like a man worth $11 billion. He wore a wrinkled flannel shirt, scuffed boots, and a canvas duffel bag that had seen better decades. To the passengers around him, he was just another tired traveler crammed into economy, the kind of man people stepped over to reach the overhead bins. But the flight attendant kneeling in the aisle beside him, refilling his water cup for the third time without being asked, had no idea that the man she was quietly taking care of owned the airline she worked for. She had no idea that her simple kindness, offered to a stranger who looked like he had nowhere left to turn, was about to change the rest of her life. And she certainly had no idea that somewhere over the Rocky Mountains, a decision was being made that would end one career, save another, and reveal exactly who deserved to wear the Vantage Airlines uniform. It all started 3 weeks earlier, in a boardroom 40 floors above Los Angeles, where nobody was thinking about kindness at all. Margaret Hale had built Vantage Airlines from 4 second-hand planes and a single gate in Fresno into one of the largest carriers in the country. For 38 years, she had personally walked the terminals, ridden in the jump seats, and eaten in the same crew lounges as her employees, because she believed a company was only as good as the way it treated the people nobody was watching. Now 68 and preparing to step back, she had one final decision to make, and it kept her awake most nights. Who would run Vantage Airlines when she was gone? Her son, 34-year-old Nathaniel Hale, had grown up inside that company. He had interned in dispatch, shadowed pilots, and could recite the entire route map from memory. On paper, he was the obvious successor, but Margaret worried about something numbers could never measure. Nathaniel had spent the last several years in the executive suite, surrounded by first-class lounges and priority boarding, and she wondered whether he still understood what it felt like to be an ordinary passenger, tired, overlooked, and easy to dismiss. One evening, in her office overlooking the runway lights, she made him an offer. "I want you to fly coast to coast, economy class, no name, no title, no company card." Nathaniel laughed, assuming she was joking. She wasn't. "You'll fly under your mother's maiden name. No one at the airline can know who you are. Not the gate agents, not the crew, no one. And if I refuse?" Margaret's voice softened, but her answer didn't. "Then maybe you aren't ready to run this company." Nathaniel sat with that for a long moment. Then he nodded. "When do I leave?" 3 days later, he boarded a red-eye out of New York, using the name Nate Prescott, dressed like a man who had spent his last $200 on the ticket. He carried no laptop, no briefcase, nothing that would give him away. As he squeezed into seat 34C, a middle seat between a snoring stranger and a crying infant, Nathaniel Hale realized he hadn't flown coach in almost 15 years. He had no idea that this cramped, uncomfortable seat was about to teach him more about his own company than any boardroom ever had. And he had no idea that somewhere down that narrow aisle, a woman named Claire Bishop was about to change everything he thought he knew about what it meant to lead. The first 2 hours of the flight were an education Nathaniel never expected. The man in 34B elbowed him twice without apologizing. A woman across the aisle snapped her fingers at a passing flight attendant, like she was calling a dog. And when Nathaniel accidentally bumped a beverage cart while returning from the restroom, a businessman in first class glanced back through the curtain and muttered, loud enough to be heard, "That's why they shouldn't let people like that walk through here." Nathaniel said nothing. He had promised himself he would only observe. But something in his chest tightened every time he watched a passenger treat the crew like furniture instead of people. He noticed her almost immediately. A flight attendant with sandy brown hair pulled into a neat bun, moving down the aisle with a calm efficiency that never seemed to crack, no matter how many passengers barked orders at her. Her name tag read Claire. She apologized to a man who spilled his own coffee. She knelt beside an elderly woman struggling with a seatbelt and fixed it without making her feel foolish. And when a toddler 2 rows up began sobbing uncontrollably, Claire crouched down, made a silly face, and had the child giggling within 30 seconds. What struck Nathaniel most wasn't her patience. It was that she treated every single passenger the exact same way, whether they were kind to her or cruel. Somewhere over Ohio, the flight hit a stretch of turbulence rough enough to rattle the overhead bins. The seatbelt sign chimed on, and passengers who had been demanding drinks moments earlier suddenly went pale and silent. Nathaniel gripped his armrest, more out of habit than real fear, but the man in 34A, an older gentleman traveling alone, went gray and began breathing in short, shallow gasps. Claire noticed instantly. She dropped into the empty jump seat beside him, took his trembling hand, and spoke to him in a low, steady voice until the shaking eased. "You're safe. I've flown through worse than this 100 times. Breathe with me." She stayed with him through the entire rough patch, even as the intercom crackled with a passenger 3 rows back, impatiently asking when drink service would resume. A lead flight attendant strode down the aisle the moment the seatbelt sign switched off, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, despite airline policy requiring flats in the cabin. Her name tag read Kimberly Voss, and her tone left no room for questions. "Bishop, you're behind on beverage service in 12 rows. We do not have time for hand-holding." Claire calmly explained the passenger had been in genuine distress. Kimberly's expression didn't soften. "His comfort isn't the priority tonight. The premium cabin's satisfaction scores are. Fix your section." She turned and walked away before Claire could respond. Nathaniel watched the exchange with quiet interest. He had heard the name Kimberly Voss before, in a quarterly performance report praising her flawless first-class service ratings. What the report never mentioned was how she achieved them, or who paid the price for her polish. As Claire straightened her apron and returned to work without complaint, Nathaniel scribbled a note on his boarding pass. Not a complaint. An observation. One he suspected would matter far more than anyone on that plane realized. By the time the plane leveled out over the Midwest, most of the cabin had drifted to sleep. Nathaniel hadn't. He sat wide awake, replaying the last 2 hours, when Claire appeared beside his row again, this time not working, just walking the aisle with a small flashlight, checking on passengers the way a nurse checks a ward at midnight. "Can't sleep?" she asked quietly, careful not to wake his neighbors. "Not really," Nathaniel admitted. "Rough flight so far." Claire smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her all night. "You get used to the turbulence. It's the passengers you never quite get used to." She said it without bitterness, more like an observation shared between 2 tired people at the end of a long day. She noticed the untouched sandwich he'd bought at the terminal, still sealed in its plastic. "You should eat something. It's a long night." "Not very hungry." Claire studied him for a moment, the way someone does when they suspect a person is carrying more than they're letting on. "First time flying coach in a while?" Nathaniel almost laughed. "Something like that. Well, for what it's worth, you're doing better than most of the people up front tonight." She said it with a wink and moved on before he could respond. Over the next few minutes, in quiet moments between service rounds, Claire and Nathaniel talked. Not about work, not about the airline, just ordinary things. She mentioned she'd been flying for 6 years. He asked if she liked it. Most days, the passengers can be difficult, but every once in a while somebody reminds you why you started. Her phone buzzed against her hip. She silenced it without looking, but not before Nathaniel caught the caller name on the screen. Dad's cardiologist. Her smile didn't slip, but something behind her eyes went tight for exactly 1 second before she tucked the phone away and kept working. Near the end of the flight, as the cabin lights dimmed further for the overnight leg, Claire crouched beside seat 34C one last time to check on the old man who'd had the panic episode earlier. He was sleeping peacefully now, a blanket tucked around his shoulders that Claire had brought from the first-class cabin without asking anyone's permission. "Doesn't that get you in trouble?" Nathaniel asked quietly. Claire shrugged. "Only if someone finds out. And even then, some rules are worth breaking." She glanced at him, this stranger in a wrinkled flannel shirt who had watched her more closely than any passenger had in months. "Try to get some sleep, okay? Something tells me you need it more than you're letting on." As she moved on down the aisle, Kimberly Voss's voice cut through the cabin from the galley, sharp enough that half of coach turned to look. "Bishop, now." Claire's shoulders dropped half an inch before she straightened them again and walked toward the sound. Nathaniel watched her go, and for the first time since boarding, he found himself thinking less about the company his mother wanted him to inherit, and more about exactly what Kimberly Voss was about to say to the one person on this flight who had done nothing but give. Claire followed Kimberly Voss into the galley, out of earshot of most passengers, though not quite out of Nathaniel's. Kimberly Voss had spent 9 years climbing toward the title of lead flight attendant, and she had no intention of losing her polish over a junior colleague she considered soft. Earlier that hour, a well-dressed couple in row 6 had complained their entertainment screen had frozen, and Kimberly appeared within seconds, apologizing, offering champagne, promising a follow-up email. 3 rows behind them, an elderly woman traveling alone had waited 15 minutes for a blanket. Kimberly walked past her twice without stopping. Attention flowed toward anyone who looked important and dried up completely for anyone who didn't. It wasn't carelessness, it was a system, one that had quietly earned her bonuses and glowing reviews from executives who only ever saw the front of the plane. A younger flight attendant, barely 3 months into the job, poked her head into the galley to ask whether she should keep offering blankets to Coach, given how far behind they'd fallen. Kimberly didn't even look up. Coach gets blankets when Coach has time. Go. The younger woman disappeared, and Kimberly turned her full attention on Claire. You've spent more time on one seat in Coach than the entire first-class cabin combined, she said, voice clipped and low. It's not a good look. And frankly, it's not your job to babysit every sob story that boards this plane. Claire kept her tone even. He seemed like he was having a hard time. I was just being decent. Kimberly's smile turned cold. Decency doesn't show up on a performance review, Bishop. Results do. Keep this up and I'll make sure your next review reflects exactly how you spent tonight's flight. She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Claire standing quietly in the galley, blinking back the sting of unfairness she'd felt too many times to count. What neither woman realized was that the passenger they had just discussed, still sitting quietly in seat 34C, had heard every word of it. And Nathaniel Hale, heir to Vantage Airlines, had just watched exactly the kind of leadership his mother had sent him to find, and exactly the kind she had warned him to look out for. Landing at LAX just before 6 in the morning, Nathaniel gathered his duffel bag and waited until most passengers had filed off before standing. Claire caught his eye near the exit and offered a tired but genuine smile. Get some real rest, okay? You earned it just surviving that middle seat. Nathaniel almost told her the truth right there. Instead, he simply said, Thank you, Claire, for everything tonight. She looked briefly surprised that he'd remembered her name from her tag, then shrugged it off with a laugh and turned to help the next row of passengers gather their bags. He didn't go home. He went straight to Vantage Airlines headquarters, still in his wrinkled flannel shirt, and asked the night security guard to let him into his own executive floor. By 7 a.m., he was standing in his mother's office, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was furious. He told Margaret everything. The blanket taken without permission to comfort a frightened stranger. The elderly woman ignored for a blanket of her own, while a couple's broken entertainment screen received 5-star treatment, and the conversation in the galley, word for word, still burned into his memory. Margaret listened in silence, her expression unreadable, until he finished. I want to know everything about Kimberly Voss's file, Nathaniel said. Every commendation, every bonus, every review. Margaret nodded slowly. And the flight attendant. Bishop, was it? Something in his voice must have given him away, because his mother's expression softened into something close to amusement. I'd like to know about her too. Careful, son. You just met her. I know exactly what I saw, Mother. 6 hours of it. By mid-morning, Vantage's Vice President of Operations, Thomas Ellery, sat across from Margaret and Nathaniel with 2 folders open on the conference table. Voss's file is immaculate, he said, sliding it forward. Award nominations, passenger commendations, a stack of 5-star survey results. Almost entirely from premium cabin. He opened the second folder. Bishop's is thin by comparison. Standard reviews. Nothing flagged. He paused, then pulled a thick stack of printed emails from underneath it. But these were never escalated. They just sat in a queue. He read the first one aloud, an elderly widow thanking Claire for holding her hand through a diverted flight after her husband's funeral. Then a father, describing how Claire had calmed his panicking daughter during an emergency landing 18 months earlier, while another attendant told him to manage his own kid. Then a young man with a service dog, 3 full paragraphs, explaining that Claire was the only crew member in 4 flights who hadn't treated his disability like an inconvenience. Nathaniel sat forward, elbows on the table. How many are there? 41, Thomas said quietly. filed and forgotten, because we score cabins by survey average, and coach surveys don't move a quarterly report. Margaret's jaw tightened. Then the report has been measuring the wrong thing for years. Nathaniel stood and walked to the window overlooking the runway. I want a company-wide town hall. Every West Coast crew member in one room. Thomas frowned. That's unusual for a service update. People will ask why. Margaret answered before her son could. Then let them ask. She closed both folders and looked at Thomas. 3 weeks. Keep it routine on paper. Nothing more said outside this room. As Thomas gathered the files and left, Margaret studied her son's reflection in the glass. You're not just building a case for Voss's termination, are you? Nathaniel didn't turn around. I'm building a case for who this airline actually belongs to. Word travels fast inside a crew base, and within days rumors were circulating through the West Coast lounge that something unusual was happening at the top. An internal review. A town hall nobody could explain. A rumor that HR had quietly pulled personnel files belonging to specific flight attendants. Nobody knew why, and Kimberly Voss, sharper than most, had a bad feeling it started with her. She noticed something else too. Claire Bishop, ordinarily invisible to management, had been photographed shaking hands with an unnamed executive at a regional safety briefing. The picture posted innocently to the company newsletter with the caption, "Recognizing excellence in the cabin." Kimberly stared at it far longer than the caption deserved. She didn't know who the man in the photo was. She only knew that Claire, plain, quiet, forgettable Claire, was suddenly being noticed by someone upstairs, and Kimberly Voss had spent 9 years believing that kind of attention was hers to earn, not hers to lose. That night, she did something she would later regret. She sent an anonymous message through the internal crew messaging system, addressed to nearly 40 flight attendants across the base. It claimed, without evidence, that Claire Bishop had been quietly favored by someone in corporate, that her sudden visibility wasn't earned, and that certain unnamed crew members had concerns about favoritism affecting upcoming promotion decisions. She never signed her name. She didn't have to. Within hours, half the base was whispering that Claire had used personal charm to climb over people who'd worked twice as hard. Claire heard the rumors the next morning from a coworker who pulled her aside with obvious discomfort. She had no idea what any of it referred to. No photo, no meeting, no executive she could name, which somehow made it worse. Everything she had built over 6 years, every extra shift, every passenger she'd stayed late to comfort, was suddenly being recast as something transactional and cheap, and she couldn't even point to what had started it. She thought of her father's medical bills, of every double shift she'd picked up to cover them, and the unfairness of it settled into her chest like a stone. That afternoon, she requested a meeting with HR and asked, quietly and without drama, to be reassigned to a different rotation, away from the West Coast base entirely. She simply said she needed a fresh start. The request landed on Thomas Ellery's desk the same day, and he brought it straight to Margaret's office, where Nathaniel happened to be reviewing town hall logistics. Nathaniel read the transfer request twice, his stomach tightening with every line. He wanted to walk straight to the crew lounge and tell Claire everything, right there, to end the rumors with 3 sentences. But revealing himself now, quietly, in a hallway, would only feed the story that she'd been secretly favored all along, and it would rob her of the one thing he owed her most, the truth, told in front of everyone who had ever doubted her, not whispered to her alone. Push the town hall up, he told his mother. I'm not letting her disappear from this company before she finds out what she actually did on that flight. Margaret studied her son for a long moment, then nodded once. 1 week, she said. Make it count. Neither of them knew that Claire's transfer paperwork was already sitting, half-signed, in a drawer 3 floors below, waiting only for a supervisor's final approval to become permanent. The town hall was held in Vantage's largest hangar at LAX, repurposed for the morning, with rows of folding chairs and a temporary stage beneath the wing of a retired 737. Over 300 flight attendants, gate agents, and ground crew filled the seats, murmuring about the vague meeting invitation that had shown up in their inboxes days earlier. Claire sat near the back, still uncertain whether to stay through the whole thing, still stinging from a week of whispered rumors she had never asked for. Margaret Hale walked onto the stage to warm applause, thanking the crowd for 38 years of building something she was prouder of than anything else in her life. Then her tone shifted, 3 weeks ago, someone boarded one of our flights without a name, without a title, and without a single person on that aircraft knowing who he really was. A murmur rippled through the hangar. He wasn't looking for special treatment. He was looking for the truth about who we've become. She looked toward the wing of the stage. Nathaniel, would you join me? Gasps rippled through the crowd as Nathaniel Hale walked out in a tailored suit, unmistakably the heir to the company. Near the back, Claire's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. For one disorienting second, her mind refused the shape of what she was seeing, the flannel shirt swapped for charcoal wool, the exhausted slouch traded for a straight-backed CEO's posture, and then it landed all at once. The man from seat 34C. The one who wouldn't eat his sandwich. The one whose water cup she'd refilled 3 times without a second thought. Her hand found the back of the chair in front of her. Kimberly Voss, seated near the front, expecting recognition for her flawless metrics, felt the floor drop out beneath her for an entirely different reason. Nathaniel spoke plainly, describing the flight in detail. The turbulence, the elderly man's panic attack, the stolen first-class blanket, the galley conversation he wasn't meant to overhear. As he described Kimberly's exact words that night, her name never once required saying, because every crew member in the West Coast base already knew exactly who it belonged to. Kimberly stared straight ahead, her face draining of color, as murmurs turned into open glances in her direction. Then Nathaniel's tone changed. There was someone else on that flight, who reminded me what this company was built on before it ever had a boardroom. His eyes found Claire near the back of the hangar. She gave a frightened stranger a blanket that wasn't hers to give. She held a panicking passenger's hand, and never once asked what it would cost her. And when I tried to thank her, she told me some rules are worth breaking. I've been thinking about that sentence for 3 weeks. Claire felt every eye in the hangar turn toward her, her cheeks burning as Margaret gently asked her to come forward. With trembling hands, Claire walked to the front. Nathaniel smiled at her, and for a moment, the entire hangar disappeared. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you the truth on that flight," he said quietly, though the microphone carried it to every corner of the room. "But everything else I told you was real." Margaret then addressed the wider issue, her voice firm. "Effective today, Vantage Airlines is changing how we measure excellence. Passenger satisfaction will no longer be scored solely by premium cabin surveys. Every crew member, in every cabin, will be evaluated by the same standard, because dignity does not have a class code." Applause broke out, uncertain at first, then thunderous. Finally, Margaret turned toward Kimberly Voss. The hangar fell silent. "Miss Voss, we've reviewed the messaging records from 2 weeks ago, along with several years of consistent, documented complaints from ground and cabin crew that were never escalated past your supervision. Your position with this airline is terminated, effective today." Kimberly stood, said nothing, and walked toward the exit with as much composure as she could hold together, 39 years of built-up pride cracking with every step. 6 months later, the Vantage Airlines crew lounge at LAX looked almost the same, except for a small brass plaque near the coffee station that read, "Every passenger, every time," beneath the airline's new dignity-based service standard. Claire Bishop, now Vantage's newly appointed director of cabin culture, walked the terminals the way Margaret Hale once had, checking in with crew members by name and listening more than she talked. Her father had recovered well enough to attend her promotion ceremony from a folding chair near the front row, proudly wearing a Vantage cap Claire had given him years earlier when she first became a flight attendant. The medical bills that had once kept her awake at night were finally behind her, not because anyone had bought her way out, but because a fairer bonus structure, one she'd personally helped design, now rewarded the kind of quiet excellence that used to go unnoticed. Nathaniel Hale, now serving as Vantage's incoming CEO, still flew coach at least twice a month, unannounced, no title, no warning. He said it kept him honest. Claire liked to tease him that he was the only billionaire she knew who still complained about legroom. Their relationship had grown slowly and deliberately, built on 6 hours in a middle seat and hundreds of ordinary conversations since. There were no grand declarations at first, only shared coffee before early shifts, quiet dinners after long days, and the kind of comfort that comes from being fully known by someone before either person had anything to prove. When Nathaniel finally proposed, it wasn't in a boardroom or a hangar full of applause. It was on a quiet evening flight home from Chicago, in seat 34C, the very seat where they'd first met. With a small ring hidden inside an empty coffee cup, he asked her to refill one more time. A year after the town hall, a small padded envelope arrived at Vantage headquarters addressed to Claire. Inside was a handwritten letter from Kimberly Voss, who had taken a position managing guest relations at a boutique hotel chain in Arizona. The letter was short. It said she had spent months blaming everyone else for what happened, until a guest at her new job reminded her, without knowing the irony, that people remember how you made them feel far longer than they remember how efficiently you served them. She wrote that she hoped Claire's new department succeeded where her own leadership had failed, and that she was, for the first time in longer than she could admit, trying to become someone worth trusting again. Claire read it twice, then wrote back 3 words. I believe you. The following spring, Claire and Nathaniel married in a small garden ceremony outside Los Angeles, with off-duty Vantage crew members filling half the seats, still in disbelief that their quiet colleague from the West Coast base was marrying the man who now ran their entire airline. As the ceremony ended and the two of them stood together beneath a canopy of string lights, Nathaniel leaned toward his new wife and whispered the same words he'd said to her the night they met, 6 months and 1 lifetime ago. Thank you, Claire, for everything. Somewhere, people still judge a stranger by the seat they're sitting in, the clothes on their back, or the cart they push down a narrow aisle at midnight. But this story is a reminder that the way you treat someone who can do absolutely nothing for you is the truest measure of who you are. Kindness is never wasted, even on a stranger in coach. And sometimes, the person you help without a second thought turns out to be the one person who changes the rest of your life. If this story moved you, leave a comment telling me what you would have done in Claire's seat. Like this video, subscribe for more emotional true-to-life stories, and stay close, because the next story we're telling might just break your heart in a different way entirely.